Are you ready to learn the truth about the price people paid for perfect order in the luxurious mansions of the 19th century? The hidden truth that everyone usually keeps quiet about is that behind the gleaming facades lay a daily, brutal struggle against the exhausting cold. The real lives of maids and footmen were strikingly different from the beautiful, cozy scenes depicted in popular historical films. The wealthy owners carefree enjoyed the warmth of huge fireplaces in their lavishly decorated living rooms and bedrooms. At the very same time, their servants toiled ceaselessly in the icy drafts of long corridors, with absolutely no right to rest. These people had to wake up long before dawn in freezing, cramped little rooms under the very roof of the huge mansion. In winter, it was so cold there that the water for morning ablutions often froze right in the clay jugs. Heating the stoves in the servants' quarters was then considered an unallowable luxury and a waste of the master's precious coal. Hard physical labor provided some warmth, but the constant, drastic temperature swings inevitably took a toll, even on the strongest of constitutions. Watch the video to the end, and you'll learn how ordinary winter colds turned into an insurmountable ordeal for thousands of workers on Victorian estates. What if I told you that everything you believed about the luxurious life of the past is a lie? The real life of a vast estate began long before dawn in the coldest, unheated parts of the house. Servants woke up in tiny rooms under the very roof, where water froze right in the wash basins during the winter. Icy air seeped through the thin cracks in the window frames, making waking up in the morning a harsh ordeal. The workday began in pitch darkness, when the maids put on their stiff, cold dresses. The thin fabric of their uniforms offered no protection at all against the damp draft that swept through the narrow corridors. They had to hurry down the steep, dark staircases to start stoking the stoves in the kitchen. The heat from the kitchen stove was their only refuge in those early hours. The maids' main task was to ensure warmth for the household's masters before they awoke. The girls carried heavy buckets of coal up the many steps to each master's bedroom. The metal handle of the bucket burned their fingers with cold, and coal dust settled on their pale faces. At the same time, the maids themselves were not allowed to light a fire in their own small rooms. Constant temperature fluctuations caused severe hypothermia. From the hot kitchen, a maid had to immediately run to the cold pantry for groceries. Returning to the warm room caused severe chills and bouts of deep coughing. It was impossible to catch one's breath, for the master's bell could ring at any moment. Weakened by constant sleep deprivation, the body quickly succumbed to the onslaught of the harsh winter. Pale skin and dark circles under the eyes were considered a common feature of the servants at this time of year. Thick fog seeping in from the streets settled as moisture on the stone floors of the semi-basement rooms. The workers breathed this heavy, damp air throughout the long day. Coughs echoed through the servants' corridors, but they had to be carefully concealed. Coughing in the presence of the masters was considered the height of impropriety and a gross breach of discipline. Therefore, the servants tried to suppress their fits by hiding in distant rooms or clenching their lips tightly. Such restraint only exacerbated the condition of their exhausted airways. A slight runny nose was not generally seen as a cause for concern or a reason to reduce one's workload. Maids continued to wash heavy curtains in icy water, standing on the cold stone slabs of the laundry room. Their hands turned red and became rough from constant contact with the icy water and harsh soap. No warm gloves were provided for such work. In the evening, after 16 hours of non-stop labor, they had just enough strength to make it to bed. The thin woolen blankets could not warm the workers' bodies, which had grown numb from the cold during the day. They wrapped themselves in their own old shawls and coats, trying to retain at least a little warmth. Sleep was restless and short, failing to provide the necessary rest and recovery. The next morning, the whole cycle repeated itself, regardless of how a person felt or how tired they were. Weakness in the legs and a heavy head became constant companions during the winter months. People worked to the limit of their abilities, hiding their exhaustion from the housekeeper's stern gaze. There were no days off, which meant there was simply no time to recover. Under such conditions, winter seemed like an endless and gloomy era that demanded incredible endurance. Every cold day that passed was seen as a small victory over the harsh natural environment and strict daily routine. We'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think about these working conditions on large estates? Write about it in the comments and be sure to subscribe to our channel. What I'm about to show you is prohibited in many modern labor law guides. In Victorian England, admitting weakness or illness was tantamount to voluntary resignation. Employers hired people to ensure their comfort, not to care for their health. A sick maid or a coughing footman was considered a useless and even unacceptable element of the ideal household. The fear of losing their jobs forced servants to display remarkable discretion and restraint. Being fired in winter meant the certain prospect of ending up on the freezing street without references or means of support. Finding a new job in the middle of the cold season was practically an impossible task for an ordinary person. Therefore, the workers silently sipped hot tea, trying to soothe their sore throats. Housekeepers and butlers kept a close eye on their subordinates' appearance and efficiency. Any slip-up, slowness, or pale complexion could be grounds for a stern reprimand. The servants had to artificially rouge their cheeks and move with feigned vigor, overcoming their intense fatigue. This constant acting drained the last remnants of energy from their exhausted bodies. Medicines were too expensive a luxury for those who earned only a few pounds a year. Servants relied on old folk remedies, such as hot water with lemon or a decoction of dried herbs. These simple remedies were kept a closely guarded secret and taken in haste, hidden away in a dark closet. Officially seeking medical care at the employer's expense was permitted only in exceptional cases for the highest-ranking servants. A common cold, endured while still on the job, quickly developed into deep and severe bronchitis. Breathing became wheezy, and every breath of London's damp air came with great difficulty. The servants continued to carry heavy trays and polish endless rows of silverware. Their hands trembled with weakness, but the polish had to shine flawlessly. The kitchen staff suffered from the heat of the scorching stoves, which was replaced by an icy draft from the back entrance. The open doors for receiving supplies from the carts let the frosty winter air into the room. The kitchen assistants stood in light aprons, breaking out in a cold sweat from the sudden change in temperature. They were not allowed to leave their posts for even a minute. The maids had to clean the fireplaces while kneeling on the icy marble floors of the living rooms. Soot and ash clogged their lungs, worsening their constant coughing and making it hard to breathe. The work required physical effort, as they had to carry out heavy ashes and bring in fresh firewood. All of this was done early in the morning, when the house was still completely frozen. Footmen stood for hours at the front door or waited for their masters by the carriages in the biting wind. Their formal liveries were tailored for beauty, not to keep them warm in the freezing weather. Thin stockings and flat-soled shoes did nothing to warm feet standing on the stone pavement. They froze like statues, unable to shift from one foot to the other. The laundresses spent their days in a thick cloud of hot steam that soaked through their clothes. When they went out into the courtyard to hang up heavy, damp sheets, the frost instantly froze their skirts. The fabric turned into an icy shell, and their hands turned red in lost sensation from the cold. This work was considered one of the hardest and most exhausting during the winter. Every evening, they returned to their cold rooms, where the only source of warmth was their neighbor's breath. Do you agree that such conditions could be called a true test of endurance? In the next chapter, you'll learn what folk remedies helped them get through yet another long day. A secret that people pay thousands for today was, back then, the only way to survive the winter. Servants formed their own system of mutual aid and folk medicine, hidden from prying eyes. On the lower floors of huge mansions, far from the glittering drawing rooms, a secret life was bustling. Here, senior maids shared recipes for warming drinks made from the master's leftover spices. The most valuable resource during the cold season was ordinary mustard powder. It was used to make warming compresses, which were applied to the chest after a long day's work. This simple remedy helped stimulate blood circulation and slightly ease labored breathing. In the kitchen, one could always find leftover ginger or cloves, which were secretly steeped in boiling water. This hot infusion warmed the throat, providing temporary relief and restoring the voices of hoarse footmen. Cooks who held the most influence among the servants could afford to set aside a little hot broth for the sick. A cup of such broth was valued above all money. Goose fat was used to rub tired joints and frozen feet. Maids rubbed it into the rough, calloused skin of their hands to prevent deep cracks from the icy water. The smell of the fat was thoroughly washed away with cheap soap so that the masters would not detect any foreign odors. The servants' appearance and scent had to remain completely neutral. To combat the chill, heated bricks or flat stones were often used. They were secretly placed near the kitchen stove and then wrapped in old woolen rags. This makeshift hot water bottle was taken to the cold bed under the roof to warm frozen feet. By morning, the stone had turned to ice, but it helped them fall asleep in the early hours. Onions and garlic were also used at the first signs of severe illness. They were placed near the narrow beds in the hope of purifying the stuffy air in the small rooms. Sometimes pieces of onion were sewn into small pouches and worn under the dress against the chest. Of course, this method was used only by those workers who did not have direct contact with the masters. Tea leaves were steeped several times until the drink turned into murky, tasteless water. But even such a hot liquid provided relief from the constant feeling of internal cold. They would cup mugs of boiling water in both hands, trying to restore feeling to their frozen fingers. These were rare moments of brief respite in the dark corners of the hallways. Warm clothing was passed down from servants who had left or grown old to the younger ones. Old knitted shawls, darned woolen stockings, and patched petticoats were worth their weight in gold. Women put on every layer of clothing they had to create at least some pocket of warm air. This made their movements stiff, but the cold was far more frightening. Male servants used old newspapers, tucking them under their thin shirts on their chests and backs. The paper provided excellent protection against the biting drafts in the mansion's vast, poorly heated halls. This trick allowed the footmen to stand motionless for hours at the front doors without a visible tremor. Any sudden movement caused the paper to rustle treacherously, so they had to move very smoothly. All these tricks helped people endure enormous strain in the absence of proper medical care. Mutual aid and resourcefulness replaced doctors, pharmacies, and warm clothing for them. If you enjoy historical details like these, please like this video. What you've never seen is the true scale of physical labor in a Victorian home. The architecture of these massive mansions was designed so that the paths of masters and servants would never cross. Narrow, dark, and steep spiral staircases were built for the servants, hidden within the thickness of the walls. In a single day, an ordinary maid would climb a distance on these steps equivalent to scaling a high mountain. In winter, these staircases turned into veritable wind tunnels through which icy winds blew. The stone steps were cold, and the lighting consisted of a few dim candles. Carrying heavy buckets of hot water or trays of dishes up them was incredibly difficult. Weakened by colds, the workers often stumbled, putting themselves in constant danger. Delivering hot water for the owner's morning ablutions was a true marathon of endurance. Huge copper jugs were filled with boiling water in the kitchen in the basement. Then they had to be carried up to the second or third floor without spilling a drop. The heavy load strained their arms, and the steam from the water settled on their faces, instantly cooling in the draft. Duties also included keeping the fires burning in all the mansion's numerous fireplaces. Coal was stored in the cellars and had to be constantly hauled upstairs in iron boxes. This dirty and heavy work was done mainly by women in long, tangled skirts. My back ached from the constant bending, and my breath was short from the physical strain. Cleaning the carpets and heavy drapes required tremendous physical strength and endurance. They were taken out to the backyard and beaten for hours with heavy sticks in the freezing air. Dust clogged their airways, triggering bouts of choking coughs in the maids who were already suffering from colds. Afterward, they had to carry the heavy, icy fabric back into the house and carefully hang it back in place. The floors in the reception halls were polished by hand, rubbing the parquet with special polishes until it shone like a mirror. The workers crawled on their knees for hours, inhaling the sharp smell of wax and turpentine. The icy floor drew the last remnants of warmth from their bodies, causing severe colds and aching muscles. It was extremely difficult to get back on one's feet after such work. The huge windows of the mansions had to be washed regularly, despite the low temperatures outside. Maids stood on high windowsills, wiping the glass with damp rags in the biting wind. The water froze right on the glass, and they had to scrub it off with double the effort. Their hands went numb from the cold, and the gusty wind threatened to blow the girls off the ledge. Cooking for the vast estate also demanded incredible effort from the kitchen staff. Heavy cast iron skillets and enormous copper pots had to be constantly moved across the scorching stove. The cooks worked in thick smoke and heat, which made stepping into the cold pantry a real shock to the body. Sudden temperature changes instantly triggered a deep cough, Even serving dishes in the dining room became a difficult ordeal for the footmen. Trays with silverware and hot food weighed dozens of kilograms. They carried them down long corridors with straight backs and impassive expressions. The slightest tremor in their hands or a moment of weakness could lead to immediate dismissal. This entire routine was repeated day after day without the slightest leniency for feeling unwell. Are you ready to find out exactly how they coped with this dreadful weather? In the next chapter, you'll see how drafts became the main enemy of these enormous mansions. The architecture of Victorian mansions was designed to create impressive facades and spacious interiors. Huge windows, high ceilings, and suites of rooms looked majestic, but did absolutely nothing to retain heat. In winter, these vast spaces turned into veritable ice caves, buffeted by every wind. Fireplaces heated only the small area immediately around the fire. Drafts swept through the long corridors, lifting heavy velvet curtains and blowing out candles. Cold air seeped through cracks in the old window frames and under the massive doors. For the servants whose work involved constant movement throughout the house, these streams of icy air were devastating. They moved from moderately warm rooms into freezing corridors hundreds of times a day. The masters could afford to sit by the fireplace itself, wrapped in warm blankets. The servants, however, were always on the periphery, near doors and windows, where the temperature was significantly lower. Waiting for orders, footmen lined up along the cold walls, trying not to shiver. Their uniforms did not include any warm elements for working inside the house. The battle against drafts fell as a heavy burden on the shoulders of the maids themselves. They placed special long pillows stuffed with sawdust along the window frames and under the doors. These homemade barriers were called sausages, and only slightly reduced the flow of cold air. Every morning they had to be removed, and every evening carefully laid out again throughout the house. The huge front doors were constantly opening, letting guests, messengers, and couriers in from the street. Each time the frosty air rushed into the hall, chilling the grand staircase and the adjoining rooms. The doormen and junior footmen bore the brunt of the icy wind. They had to greet guests politely without showing how cold they were. The kitchen, located in the basement, was the only truly warm place in the entire massive building. A massive cast iron stove burned continuously, radiating intense heat and warming the stone vaults. But it was precisely because of this heat that the kitchen staff were most vulnerable to drafts. Any gust of cold air from the street instantly cooled their heated bodies. The attic rooms where the female servants slept were located directly under the thin roof. In winter, frost often formed on the ceiling, and the water in the jugs froze into a solid block of ice. Drafts blew through the unsealed rafters, sucking the last remnants of warmth from the thin blankets. The girls had to sleep pressed close together so as not to freeze completely. The male servants often spent the night in the basement rooms or above the stables, where it was just as cold. Dampness from the ground seeped through the floors, making the air heavy and clammy. Clothes hung on a chair in the evening were damp and icy by morning. Putting them on was a true test of willpower before the start of a long workday. Staying warm was a constant, round-the-clock battle in which the servants had no chance of winning. They could only minimize the effects by wrapping themselves in rags and huddling against warm pipes. The winter months turned into a marathon for survival, where the main prize was keeping one's job. No improvements in working conditions were in sight, as this was considered the norm of the era. Energy was expended not only on hard physical labor, but also on maintaining body temperature. The body wore out twice as fast, requiring quality nutrition and proper rest. But neither was available to the workers of Victorian estates by virtue of their status. They continued to perform their duties, fading into gray shadows against the backdrop of gleaming interiors. What would happen if no one found out about this meager ration that sustained entire estates? The workers' diet was strictly regulated and differed greatly from what was served at the master's table. The main goal was to feed people as cheaply as possible, providing them with the minimum energy needed for work. There was no question of culinary delights or vitamins during the winter. The diet consisted mainly of cheap carbohydrates, such as stale bread, potatoes, and watery porridge. Meat appeared on the servants' table extremely rarely, most often in the form of scraps or tendons. These leftovers were boiled in large cauldrons, creating a cloudy broth with the smell of onions and cabbage. The hot soup warmed them from the inside, but did not provide the necessary energy for hard labor. Fresh vegetables and fruits in winter were an unattainable luxury, even for some well-off people. Servants ate pickled vegetables from barrels and dried peas, which required long cooking. Vitamin deficiency led to constant weakness, dull hair, and pale skin. Weakened by poor nutrition, their immune systems could not withstand constant exposure to the cold. Tea was the main beverage, but the cheapest and lowest quality varieties were purchased for the servants. Often they were given used tea leaves from the master's table, which were brewed again. This drink was sweetened with a tiny piece of sugar or drunk without any at all. The main value of such tea lay in the fact that it was hot. The servants' lunch took place in strict silence in a special room on the ground floor. At the head of the long wooden table sat the butler and the housekeeper, who strictly enforced discipline. Mealtime was strictly limited, so they had to eat very quickly. They had to chew hurriedly, swallowing tough pieces almost whole. When someone was sick, the diet did not improve in any way. No one prepared special broth or nourishing porridge for a maid with a cold. She had to eat the same coarse food as everyone else, or go hungry. Often, due to severe weakness and coughing, her appetite disappeared entirely, which only accelerated her exhaustion. Kitchen workers would sometimes secretly snatch leftovers from the master's plates before they were washed. This was considered a serious offense, for which one could be immediately fired without severance pay. But the constant feeling of hunger and the cold forced people to take this risk. A piece of good cheese or a sweet roll seemed like an incredible delicacy. Drinking water in the winter was ice cold, and drinking it in the chilly hallways was unpleasant. Because of this, many workers constantly suffered from mild dehydration. Hot water was saved for washing dishes and laundry. Using it for drinking was considered wasteful. Fluids were consumed mainly in the form of thin soup and weak tea. Dinners consisted of leftovers from the day's meal, often cold and unappetizing. Bread with a thin layer of cheap lard was the standard conclusion to a grueling 16-hour workday. After such a dinner, there was barely enough strength left to make it to one's frozen bed. The body received no resources to recover before the next workday. Such a meager diet made winter illnesses protracted and extremely exhausting for a person. Could you have survived on such a meager ration while doing hard labor? In the next chapter, you will learn what the true cost of clean clothes in those huge houses was. The work of laundresses in Victorian England was always considered one of the most difficult, but in winter it turned into a true test of endurance. Laundries were located in outbuildings or deep basements where there was constant dampness. Huge copper boilers boiled all day long, filling the room with thick, suffocating steam. It was hard to breathe in such an atmosphere, even for a perfectly healthy person. The women stood on wet stone floors in wooden shoes that offered no protection from the cold. Their hands were constantly in boiling water or in icy water while rinsing the laundry. Harsh alkaline soap corroded their skin, leaving deep cracks and redness on their hands. Due to the constant humidity, the laundresses' clothes were soaked through and clung unpleasantly to their bodies. Washing heavy linen sheets and tablecloths required significant physical effort. The wet fabric was very heavy. It had to be lifted, wrung out, and transferred to huge wooden tubs. The muscles of the back and arms were under constant, intense strain for 12 hours straight. In winter, this fatigue was compounded by a constant heaviness in the body caused by the dampness. The hardest part was drying the laundry outdoors in the courtyard. The laundresses carried heavy baskets of wet fabric out into the frost and wind. The damp laundry froze before their eyes, turning into stiff, icy slabs. Hanging such sheets on high lines was extremely uncomfortable and cold. The wind pierced through the women's thin shawls, instantly cooling their bodies, which had been steamed in the laundry room. This sharp contrast in temperatures was the main cause of severe colds and deep chest coughs. Upon returning to the stuffy laundry room, they would break out in a sweat again, continuing the endless cycle of their work. They were strictly forbidden to rest or warm themselves by the stove. Ironing required just as much effort, as the cast iron irons were heated directly over an open fire. The irons weighed several kilograms, and they had to be handled quickly and carefully so as not to ruin the delicate fabrics. The heat from the stove burned their faces, while an icy draft swept across the laundry room floor. This work required intense concentration, despite extreme fatigue. In these damp basements, colds quickly turned into lingering respiratory illnesses. The laundress's constant coughing surprised no one. It was considered a professional attribute of their trade. Because of the noise of the boiling water and the clatter of the wooden rollers, this cough was often not even heard. The women worked in silence, conserving their breath for the heavy, physical labor. They were not issued warm clothing for going out into the yard, as this was considered an unnecessary expense. They would drape pieces of old burlap or worn-out woolen blankets over their shoulders. Their hands remained bare, as it was impossible to clip the laundry onto the lines with wooden clothespins while wearing gloves. The skin on their fingers lost sensitivity and often cracked from the cold. Taking down the frozen laundry was a separate kind of hard labor at the end of a short winter day. The icy sheets had to be carefully folded into baskets without breaking the frozen folds of fabric. Then they were carried back indoors for final drying near the hot stoves. The air was thick with the pungent smell of wet wool, hot soap, and coal smoke. The laundresses aged very quickly, their backs bent, and their faces took on an unhealthy pallor. This exhausting labor drained all their strength, leaving no energy to maintain their own health. When one of the servants finally took to their bed with a winter cold, the situation became critical. Victorian homes did not provide separate rooms or isolation wards for sick workers. The sick person remained in their cold bed in the attic, sharing the cramped space with neighbors who were still healthy. This created conditions ripe for the rapid spread of illness among the entire staff. Caring for a sick colleague fell on the shoulders of their roommates or friends. They had to do this in secret, stealing moments from their already packed work schedules. Senior maids turned a blind eye to the girls' brief absences, provided the work was completed on time. The help consisted of bringing a mug of water or adjusting a thin blanket that had slipped out of place. In the kitchen, they secretly gathered bread scraps or left a little liquid soup at the bottom of the pot. They carried this meager food up the dark staircases, risking being caught by the strict housekeeper. Hot broth was the only way to sustain the fading strength of a sick person. Eating while lying in a cold room was uncomfortable, but it was the only chance to regain strength. Washing the sick person's clothes was a separate problem, since the laundry room was always occupied with the household's own items. Soiled shirts were washed by hand in icy water in wash basins, using scraps of hard soap. They were dried right in the cold attic rooms, where they hung for several days, remaining damp. Putting a damp shirt on a weakened body was unpleasant and extremely harmful. It was practically impossible to heat the sick person's room due to the ban on lighting fires in the attics. Neighbors brought heated bricks from the kitchen, trying to preserve at least a little warmth under the blanket. The sick person's breath turned into white vapor in the frosty air of the unheated attic room. The only source of real warmth was the bodies of the neighbors sleeping nearby at night. Recovery was extremely slow due to the complete lack of rest and the constant cold draft. A cough echoed through the narrow corridors, disturbing the restless sleep of the other exhausted workers. Weakness lingered for weeks, pinning a person to a hard mattress stuffed with cheap straw. The days dragged on endlessly in the dim light of tiny windows covered in snow. If a worker could not return to his duties for too long, his fate was sealed. The house manager would issue a discharge notice without regret, ordering the occupied bunk to be vacated immediately. The convalescent had to gather his meager belongings and go out into the winter street. Finding a new place without references and with obvious signs of illness was impossible. The realization of this prospect forced many to get out of bed long before they were fully recovered. Staggering from weakness and leaning on the walls, they returned to their grueling daily routine. They tried to hide their pale faces and tired eyes by busily polishing furniture or washing floors. Every step was a struggle, but the fear of the street was stronger than their physical weakness. Colleagues tried to take on some of the work themselves to help their comrade get through the first few days. Footmen helped carry heavy buckets, and maids took on part of the stair cleaning. This silent solidarity was their only protection against the strict system of exploiting others' labor. They understood that any one of them could be in the sick person's place tomorrow. Thus, illness was not only a physical ordeal, but also an immense psychological strain. It threatened to shatter all the fragile stability that working in a large household provided. In the Victorian era, servants' uniforms served as a marker of their employer's status rather than as comfortable clothing. They were tailored with aesthetics in mind and to ensure a clear division of roles within the vast household. Maids wore dresses made of stiff cotton that were easy to wash, but offered absolutely no warmth. In winter, this thin fabric was bone-chilling, leaving the girls defenseless against the drafts in the grand halls. Black dresses with white starched aprons looked neat but were extremely impractical for work. The starch made the fabric stiff, and it felt uncomfortably cold against the neck and wrists. Under the dress, only simple cotton undergarments and thin petticoats were permitted. Wearing thick woolen garments was forbidden, as they ruined the uniform's elegant silhouette. Men's formal livery was even more demanding in terms of appearance and less suited for winter. Footmen wore tight-fitting doublets, short breeches, and thin white stockings that hugged their calves. Dressed this way, they stood by open doors, greeting guests in the frosty January wind. The wool fabric of the waistcoats was thin, so that their movements would remain elegant while serving dishes. Footwear for the servants posed a particular problem during the cold season. Since they were required to move about the house silently, the maids wore thin shoes with soft, flat soles. These shoes did not insulate their feet from the cold of the stone and marble floors on the ground floors. Their feet were constantly cold, which quickly led to general hypothermia in their weakened bodies. Special warm clothing was often not provided for going outside on errands for the masters. Errand boys ran through the snow-covered city in their usual thin jackets and caps. They returned chilled to the bone, but had to immediately get back to their indoor duties. Warming up by the kitchen stove took only a few minutes until the cook shooed them away. The headwear of the female servants was limited to thin lace bonnets, which served no purpose in keeping them warm. Their hair was gathered into tight, smooth buns, leaving their necks and ears exposed to the cold drafts. When washing windows or cleaning carpets in the courtyard, this became a critical health hazard. The wind instantly chilled their heads, causing severe fatigue and colds. The requirement for spotless uniforms forced the maids to wash their aprons and collars frequently. They had to iron them at night, sacrificing precious hours of their short winter sleep. A damp collar, put on early in the morning against a cold neck, caused an unpleasant shiver throughout the body. But appearing before the housekeeper looking disheveled was absolutely unthinkable and strictly punished. Any alterations made to the uniform for warmth had to be carefully hidden from the watchful eyes of the authorities. The girls sewed old scraps of wool to the inside of their bodices to protect their chests from the icy air. These secret inserts made the dresses tight, making it hard to breathe while climbing the endless staircases. But it was the only way to retain at least a little warmth throughout the day. The house managers ensured that the servants looked equally impeccable in every season. A nose pale from the cold or a footman's trembling hands spoiled the overall impression of wealth and prosperity. Therefore, the staff tried to rub their faces with rough towels before entering the reception halls. This artificial cheerfulness masked deep physical exhaustion. The uniform was a symbol of submission, and wearing it required a complete renunciation of personal comfort. In winter, this sacrifice came at a particularly high cost, measured in constant fatigue and loss of strength. The physical hardships of winter work were compounded by the severe moral pressure the servants endured every day. The vast gulf between their icy attics and their masters' luxurious, warm halls weighed heavily on their minds. They created a sense of coziness and comfort that the servants themselves were not allowed to touch even for a moment. This constant distance was perceived as an unshakable law of the universe, not subject to any discussion. The lack of personal space and time made it impossible to recover psychologically after a hard day. The workday lasted up to 16 hours, and the rest of the time was spent on a short sleep. They had no opportunity to be in silence, to read, or simply to sit quietly by the fire. Their entire lives were governed by a strict schedule and the sound of a ringing bell. Fear of the future was a constant backdrop to the thoughts of workers in Victorian mansions. Old age or serious illness meant immediate loss of work and a roof over one's head, with no guarantees whatsoever. There were no pensions or insurance. Everything depended solely on a person's physical endurance. Winter intensified these fears, as it was during the cold months that health most often failed. The employer's attitude toward the servants was often utterly indifferent, as if they were inanimate machines. They were expected to be invisible, silent, and to perform their complex duties flawlessly. No one cared about their well-being, fatigue, or personal problems left behind the mansion's doors. Employers viewed illness not as a human problem, but as an annoying disruption to the household. Loneliness was a frequent companion for those who worked far from their home villages and families. Letters arrived rarely, and days off were granted sparingly, making trips home impossible. Winter holidays, such as Christmas, meant only a doubling of the heavy workload for the servants. While the masters rested in warm halls, the servants collapsed from exhaustion in the kitchens. Competition among workers also did little to ease the strain of their difficult daily lives. Junior maids dreamed of taking the place of their seniors to gain a little more privilege and money. This struggle for stability sometimes led to tension within the group. Under conditions of constant stress and cold, people often took out their frustration on their own colleagues. Losing a good recommendation was tantamount to being barred from finding decent work. A servant dismissed for insubordination or frequent illness could no longer find employment in a respectable household. Their only option was to head to the poorest neighborhoods for grueling factory work. This fear forced them to silently endure any orders from the housekeeper or butler. Dim lighting and short daylight hours in winter exacerbated the feeling of constant depression and fatigue. People left for work in the dark and returned to their cold rooms in the dark as well. Sunlight rarely penetrated through the frosted, tiny windows of the attic and basement rooms. The lack of light made their faces even paler and their moods even gloomier. The only consolation was the rare moments of relative calm late at night on the lower floors. Gathering around the cooling kitchen stove, they could quietly exchange a few words or mend their clothes. In those moments, they felt like living people, not just cogs in a vast machine. But even then, they listened intently to the silence of the house, ready to spring into action at the first call. The hopelessness of this situation shaped the unique, stoic character of the Victorian domestic staff. They learned to accept the cold, fatigue, and tension as an inevitable part of their professional fate. As we can see, behind the glittering facade of the Victorian era lay the harsh reality of daily survival and the grueling labor of domestic servants. Winter was a cruel ordeal that demanded incredible resilience from the workers, where every change of linens or stoking of the fireplace took a toll on their health. Suggest topics in the comments for future videos that you'd like to see on our channel so we can uncover new historical secrets. And be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our new in-depth dives into the hidden details of the past.